The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the entire chamber, bouncing off 1,000 different faces from 1,000 different worlds, and for the first time since I had taken my seat on the Galactic Council, I saw fear on every single one of them at once. My name is Vec Thaler. I am not human. I come from a world called Isvena, far past the edge of what most humans have ever mapped, and I was sent here to represent my people on the Council, the great assembly where every major species in the galaxy sits together to decide the fate of trade routes, borders, and wars. I had served on this council for 6 cycles before the day everything changed. I had seen arguments, threats, even small conflicts between minor powers. I had never seen anything like this. It started with a single message. Just one line, sent from a human ship called the Wanderer's Hope, stationed near a quiet border system that nobody cared about. The message said only this: they are firing on us. Then the signal went dark. I remember looking around the chamber and seeing confusion, not concern. A delegate from the Threll Assembly, a tall insect-like being with silver eyes, actually laughed. He said humans always overreact to small skirmishes. He said their species was still learning the difference between an accident and an attack. Nobody expected what would happen next. Because 30 seconds later, every screen in the chamber lit up with a second message. This one was not from a ship. It was from Earth itself, sent through the official human channel reserved only for matters of war. It read, "We have identified the aggressor. We are responding. Please clear all non-combatant vessels from the following coordinates within 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I remember thinking that was strange. Most species would take days to confirm an attack, gather evidence, hold meetings, argue about proportional response. Humans gave the galaxy 10 minutes to get out of the way. I want to explain something about how the rest of us saw humanity before that day, because it matters for what comes later. Humans had only joined the Council 8 cycles earlier. They were the newest member species, the smallest fleet, the least advanced technology by almost every measurement we had. Their ships were slower than ours. Their weapons were weaker on paper. Their population was scattered across a handful of systems, while species like the Threll controlled hundreds of worlds. We did not see them as a threat. We saw them as guests, tolerated because the rules said every sentient species deserved a seat, not because anyone believed they deserved respect. I will admit, I held that same view. I remember a conversation I had with a human diplomat months before the incident, a calm woman named Laura Bennett who represented Earth on matters of trade. I asked her once, half joking, why her species seemed so quiet in council meetings, so unwilling to raise their voice even when other delegates spoke over them. She smiled at me in a way I did not understand at the time and said, "We are listening more than we are speaking." I laughed it off. I thought she meant they were simply shy, still new to this large stage of alien politics. I did not understand what she truly meant until the day of the attack. The aggressor, it turned out, was a faction within the Threll Assembly itself, a splinter group of military commanders who did not believe humans belonged on the Council at all. They had grown tired of watching the newest species get an equal vote on decisions that affected ancient empires. They decided to test humanity, to see how far they could push before Earth simply backed down the way every other smaller power had done in the past when threatened by a larger force. They chose the Wanderer's Hope because it was lightly armed, sent mostly for scientific research near the border. They assumed a strike against a research vessel would send a message without provoking real conflict. They assumed wrong. In the council chamber, panic began to spread the moment the second human message appeared on every screen. The Threll delegate who had laughed earlier stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He shouted that this was an act of war, that humans had no right to threaten a response without council approval first. Other delegates began shouting too, some defending the ancient rule that any military action required a vote, others simply confused about what was actually happening at the border. I turned to the delegate beside me, an older being from a quiet aquatic species called the Doru, who had served on the council far longer than I had. She was watching the human data feed with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not anger, not confusion, something closer to recognition, like she had seen this pattern before in some old record and hoped she would never see it again. I asked her what she thought would happen. She did not answer right away. She just kept watching the numbers on the screen, the countdown the humans had given, ticking down toward 0. With less than 2 minutes left, she finally spoke, and her voice was quiet enough that only I could hear it. She said, "I do not think the humans are asking us to clear the area because they are being polite. I think they are asking because whatever they are about to do, they do not want witnesses close enough to get hurt by accident." I did not understand what she meant. Not yet. The countdown reached 0, and for a moment nothing happened. The chamber went silent, waiting. Even the delegates who had been shouting moments before fell quiet, staring at the screens showing the border system in real time. I remember holding my breath, though I do not need to breathe the way humans do. It was simply instinct, the tension in the room pressing down on all of us equally. Then the feed changed. What we saw next is something I have tried to describe many times since that day, to other delegates, to historians, even to my own family back on Isvena, and I have never found the right words. The closest I can offer is this. It was not a battle. A battle takes time. What we witnessed took seconds. There was a flash of light near the coordinates the humans had given, followed almost instantly by a wave of static across every sensor feed monitoring that region of space. When the feeds cleared, the aggressor fleet, 12 heavily armed Threll warships that had been sent to make an example of Earth, were simply gone. Not damaged, not retreating, gone, as if they had never existed at all. The chamber erupted into noise again, but this time it was not shouting about rules or procedure. It was raw disbelief. I heard delegates from species I respected, species that had commanded fleets and fought wars long before humans had even discovered how to leave their own solar system, asking the same question over and over. How? How did they do that? How is that possible? I looked at Laura Bennett's seat, empty that day, because she had been called back to Earth days earlier, for reasons nobody had explained. I remember thinking, she must have known this was coming. The Threll delegate, who had laughed at the first warning, was no longer standing. He had sat back down, his silver eyes wide, staring at the screen where 12 of his people's warships had existed only minutes before. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody needed to. We were all thinking the same thing, and none of us wanted to say it out loud in front of the others. The species we had welcomed onto this council out of obligation, the species we had privately considered the weakest among us, had just erased an entire attacking fleet in under a minute, using a method none of our combined sensor networks could even properly explain. And they had done it so calmly, so quietly, that they had taken the time to warn everyone nearby to clear the area first, like a builder warning neighbors before a controlled demolition. I sat in my chair, surrounded by the loudest chamber I had ever witnessed, and I realized something that chilled me more than the attack itself. The humans had not panicked. They had not called an emergency session. They had not demanded the council's permission before acting. They had simply identified a threat, calculated a response, warned everyone in the way, and removed the problem entirely, all within the time it took most of us to finish reading the first message. That was the moment I understood we did not know humanity at all. We had judged them by their ships, their weapons on paper, their small numbers and their quiet manners in meetings. We had never once considered that a species could be dangerous, not because of the size of its fleet, but because of the speed and certainty of its decisions. We had been measuring the wrong thing the entire time. As the chamber descended further into arguments about what this meant, about whether the council needed to summon Earth's representatives immediately, about whether this act violated 100 different treaties, I found myself staring at that empty seat where Laura Bennett usually sat, and thinking about the words she had said to me months earlier. We are listening more than we are speaking. I did not know it then, but that single sentence would echo in my mind for the rest of my life, because I was about to learn exactly how much humanity had been listening, and exactly how long they had been preparing for a moment just like this one. The council chamber did not calm down for hours. I have attended sessions that lasted entire days without a single raised voice, careful debates about trade tariffs or mining rights that moved so slowly some delegates fell asleep in their chairs. This was nothing like that. Within minutes of the fleet vanishing from our screens, half the chamber was on its feet, shouting over translators that struggled to keep up with the speed of the arguments. The Threll ambassador, a senior figure named Corvath Des, who had not been present when his people's ships were destroyed, arrived late and furious. He demanded an emergency vote to condemn what he called an unprovoked act of aggression by Earth. He stood at the center platform, his forearms raised, insisting that no species had the right to act without council approval, that this was exactly the kind of behavior that had been feared when humans were first admitted. I watched him carefully. I noticed that he never once mentioned why those 12 warships had been sent to that border system in the first place, or what their orders had actually been. Nobody in the chamber asked him directly, not yet, because the shock of what had happened was still too fresh. It would take time for the right questions to surface. A representative from the Doru delegation, seated near me, finally raised a hand and asked for quiet. Her name was Sayla Vantor, and she was known across the council for her patience, the kind of patience that comes from a species that lives many centuries and has learned not to rush toward conclusions. She asked Corvath Des a simple question. She asked him what his ships were doing at that border in the first place, since the coordinates given did not match any authorized Threll patrol route on record. The chamber went quiet again, waiting for his answer. Corvath Des hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. He said the ships were on a routine security patrol, nothing more. Sayla Vantor did not accept this easily. She asked why a routine patrol required 12 heavily armed warships instead of the usual 2 or 3. She asked why those ships approached a human research vessel directly, instead of simply passing through the system as patrols normally did. I could see delegates around the chamber beginning to lean forward, listening more closely now. Even those who had been shouting minutes earlier fell silent, sensing that something important was being uncovered. It was at this point that a new voice entered the conversation, transmitted directly into the chamber through the official Earth channel. It was Laura Bennett. She had not been present physically, but her voice came through clearly, steady and calm, the same tone I remembered from our conversations months earlier. She said that Earth had intercepted communications weeks in advance, showing that a faction within the Threll military had been planning an act of intimidation against a human vessel, specifically chosen because it was lightly armed and far from any major human fleet. She said Earth had shared this information with the Council's security office days earlier, following proper procedure, and had received no response. This claim caused an uproar. Several delegates turned toward the Council's security office representative, a quiet official who had said almost nothing throughout the entire session. He admitted, after being pressed by nearly a dozen different voices at once, that a report had indeed been filed by Earth, but it had been placed lower in priority because it involved what he called an unproven internal matter within an allied species. I remember feeling something twist inside me at that moment, something between anger and embarrassment. Humanity had done everything correctly. They had detected the threat early. They had reported it through official channels exactly as the rules required. And the Council, trusting an older and more established species over its newest member, had simply set the warning aside. Laura Bennett continued speaking, her voice never rising, never carrying the anger I would have expected after such a discovery. She explained that once the threat became active, once actual weapons were fired at a human vessel, Earth's military protocol required an immediate and decisive response, both to protect the crew and to prevent further escalation by demonstrating that any future attempt would be met the same way. She said the 10-minute warning was given specifically so no other ships, human or otherwise, would be caught in the response. A young delegate from a smaller species called the Ilketh, seated near the back of the chamber, asked the question that seemed to be on everyone's mind. He asked how humanity had developed a weapon capable of eliminating 12 armed warships in under a minute, when every technological assessment on record showed human military capability far behind almost every other council species. She said that humanity had learned, throughout its own history, that being underestimated was often the safest place to stand, and that it would not be appropriate to discuss the specific nature of the response in an open council session while investigations were still ongoing. This answer satisfied almost no one, but it also gave no one a clear reason to push further, because the alternative was admitting that the security office had ignored a legitimate warning and allowed an attack to happen in the first place. I spent the rest of that day watching the chamber shift from panic to something quieter and more uncomfortable. Delegates who had spent years treating human representatives as minor voices in larger conversations were suddenly reviewing old transcripts, old meeting notes, trying to remember every time a human delegate had spoken and wondering if they had missed something important each time. I thought back to every interaction I'd had with human representatives since they joined the council. I remembered a young man named Daniel Voss, who worked alongside Laura Bennett on matters of interspecies law, and how he used to sit quietly through long sessions, rarely speaking unless directly addressed. I had once assumed his silence meant he had little to contribute. Now I wondered what he had actually been doing during all those quiet hours. That evening, after the formal session ended without any resolution, I found myself walking through the long corridors of the council station, still trying to process everything I had witnessed. I did not expect to run into Daniel Voss himself, standing near one of the observation windows that looked out over the vast star field surrounding the station. I approached him carefully, unsure if he would want to speak with anyone from another delegation after a day like this one. He turned toward me and offered a small, tired smile, the kind of expression that suggested exhaustion rather than pride. I asked him directly if he had known this attack was coming. He did not answer right away. Instead, he asked me a question of his own. He asked what I thought would have happened if Earth had simply reported the threat and then waited for the council to hold a vote, debate the matter for days, and eventually decide on a response. I did not have a good answer. I knew from experience how slowly the council moved on matters involving established species like the Threll, especially when the accusations came from a newer member with less political influence. Daniel Voss nodded slowly, as if he had expected that silence. He said that humanity had learned a long time ago, through many difficult chapters of its own history, that waiting for permission during an active threat often cost more lives than acting decisively the moment a threat became real. He said Earth's leaders had discussed this exact scenario long before ever joining the council, understanding that as the newest and smallest member, humanity would eventually be tested by someone who assumed weakness meant an easy target. I asked him what humanity had used to destroy 12 warships so quickly, since nothing in our records suggested such a capability existed. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. He said that humanity had spent generations building weapons meant only for defense, technology designed never to be used unless every other option had already failed. He said the true danger of humanity was never meant to be seen, and that the Council, along with every other species watching that day, had just witnessed the smallest possible use of it, a single controlled response meant only to remove an immediate threat without causing wider destruction. I remember feeling a chill at those words, not because they sounded like a threat, but because of how calmly he said them, the same quiet tone Laura Bennett had used in the chamber earlier. It was not pride. It was not satisfaction. It was simply the tone of someone stating a fact they wished had never needed to become true. Before he walked away that evening, Daniel Voss said one more thing to me, something I have never forgotten. He said that humanity did not join this council hoping to prove it was the strongest species in the galaxy. He said they joined hoping they would never have to prove it at all. But he said that if they were ever forced to, they had made sure the demonstration would be impossible to misunderstand. I stood alone at that window for a long time after he left, staring out at the stars, thinking about every quiet human delegate I had underestimated over the years, and wondering just how much more they had been keeping hidden behind that patient, listening silence. 3 days after the attack, the Council requested full access to the sensor data from the border system, hoping to understand exactly what had happened to the 12 Threll warships. I was assigned, along with Sela Vantor and 2 engineers from a neutral species called the Ovrin, to review the footage in a secure viewing room deep within the station. None of us knew what to expect. None of us were prepared for what we saw. The footage began normally enough. The Threll fleet approached the human research vessel in tight formation, clearly intending to intimidate rather than negotiate. Weapons fire from the lead ship struck the Wanderer's Hope directly, damaging its outer hull and causing what the recovered crew later confirmed were several injuries aboard. This was the moment the first distress message had been sent. What happened next, when slowed down frame by frame, revealed something none of us had noticed during the chaos of the live feed. A single human vessel, far smaller than any of the 12 Threll warships, appeared at the edge of the system less than 90 seconds after the attack began. It had not been visible on any sensor sweep before that moment, which the Ovrin engineers found deeply troubling, since it meant the ship had either arrived using technology far beyond anything documented, or it had been sitting silently in that region long before the attack even started. The ship did not fire immediately. Instead, sensor logs showed it broadcasting the exact same warning message the entire council had already seen, the same 10-minute countdown given to clear the area. What the wider feeds had not captured, because they were focused on the human channels and not on internal fleet communications, was that this small vessel was also broadcasting a private channel directly to the 12 Threll ships, one that only their own systems could receive. Sela Vantor asked if we could access the contents of that private message. After some effort, the Ovrin engineers managed to recover a partial transcript, translated from the original Threll military code. The message was brief. It informed the fleet commander that his ships had been identified, that his orders had been traced back through several layers of falsified authorization, and that he had 10 minutes to withdraw before the situation would be resolved permanently. I remember sitting in that room, reading those words, and feeling a strange kind of dread settle over me. The humans had not only detected an unauthorized attack in progress, they had already traced its origin, uncovered the falsified orders behind it, and communicated all of this directly to the attacking fleet, all within the same window of time most species would still be confirming basic sensor readings. The fleet commander did not withdraw. According to the recovered communications, he responded with open hostility, believing the warning was a bluff, meant to frighten a smaller, less experienced species into backing down. He ordered his ships to continue their assault on the research vessel, assuming that no realistic threat could exist from a single small ship facing 12 armed warships. 10 minutes later, exactly as promised, the response came. What we saw next, replayed slowly across our screens, was unlike anything recorded in any council archive. The small human vessel released what appeared to be a coordinated series of extremely precise strikes, each one targeting a different Threll warship simultaneously, rather than one at a time. There was no prolonged battle, no exchange of continuous fire the way traditional warfare between fleets normally unfolded. Each strike disabled a ship's critical systems within a fraction of a second, followed almost instantly by a secondary event that caused each vessel to break apart cleanly, without the kind of widespread destructive spread that would have endangered anything else nearby. One of the Ovrin engineers, a calm and normally unshakable being named Trask Wenmar, said something that stayed with me long after that session ended. He said the strikes were not simply powerful. They were controlled with a level of precision that suggested the humans had not been trying to destroy the ships in the most efficient way possible, but in the most contained way possible, ensuring no debris field, no radiation leak, and no lingering danger would threaten any other vessel in that region, including any civilian ships that might pass through later. This detail troubled the room more than the destruction itself. A weapon capable of eliminating 12 warships instantly was frightening on its own. A weapon designed specifically to do so without causing any secondary harm, requiring a level of control and restraint that implied years of careful engineering, suggested something far more advanced than simple brute force. It suggested a species that had spent a long time preparing for a moment, exactly like this one, refining their methods, not to maximize destruction, but to maximize precision. Sayla Vantor asked the question that none of us wanted to voice aloud. She asked what would happen if humanity ever chose to remove that restraint entirely. None of us answered her. None of us could. We spent the rest of that session reviewing the recovered crew reports from the Wanderer's Hope, the human research vessel that had originally come under attack. The ship's captain, a steady-voiced woman named Grace Fenwick, described the moments before the response arrived. She said her crew had been trained for exactly this kind of situation, understanding that if their vessel ever came under unauthorized attack near a border system, a response unit would be dispatched automatically once certain conditions were met, without requiring direct communication with Earth Command in real time. This detail struck me deeply. It meant the 10-minute countdown, the calm evacuation warning given to the wider region, and the precise coordinated strike had not required a single decision from any human authority during the event itself. It had all been prepared long before that day, built into protocols meant to activate the moment a genuine threat was confirmed, removing the delay that comes from waiting for permission during a crisis. Grace Fenwick said something else that I have thought about often since that day. She said her crew was frightened during the attack, understandably so, given the damage their ship had already taken and the uncertainty of what might happen next. But she said the moment they received confirmation that a response unit had been dispatched, the fear in her crew changed almost immediately into something closer to relief, because they knew, without needing to be told, exactly what was coming. I asked her, through the recorded transcript we were reviewing, whether she had ever doubted the response would succeed. Her answer, translated and read aloud in that quiet viewing room, was simple. She said no. She said every member of Earth's forces trained under the understanding that when a response was needed, it would not fail, because failure had never been considered an acceptable outcome during the years spent designing these systems. By the end of that session, the four of us sat in silence for a long while, none of us quite ready to summarize what we had just witnessed for the wider council. Sayla Vantor finally spoke, saying that we now had a duty to report our findings honestly, regardless of how uncomfortable those findings might be, for the delegates who had spent years dismissing humanity as the weakest member of this assembly. I agreed with her, though a part of me already understood how difficult that report would be to deliver. It was one thing to witness an attack and feel shock in the moment. It was another thing entirely to review the evidence carefully and realize that everything Earth had done, from the earliest warning message to the final precise strike, had been the result of careful planning developed long before any of us had ever taken this threat seriously. As we prepared our report for the full council session the following day, I found myself thinking again about something Daniel Voss had told me during our conversation at the observation window. He said humanity never wanted to prove they were the strongest species in the galaxy. They only wanted to make sure, if that proof was ever demanded of them, that no one would ever need to ask twice. Looking at the evidence spread across our screens that day, I understood exactly what he meant, and I understood, perhaps for the first time, just how much the rest of the galaxy still had left to learn about the species we had once welcomed into this council out of nothing more than obligation. The full council session the next day was unlike anything I had experienced in my 6 cycles of service. Every seat was filled, including several delegates who rarely attended sessions unless a matter directly affected their own territory. Word of what we had found in the sensor data had already spread through informal channels, and the entire chamber carried a tension I had never felt before, the kind of quiet that comes from a room full of people who suspect they are about to hear something that will change how they see the world. Sayla Vantor presented our findings first, walking the chamber through the timeline exactly as we had reconstructed it. She described the falsified orders behind the Threll fleet's movement, the private warning sent directly to the attacking ships, and the precise, contained nature of the human response. She did not editorialize. She simply presented the facts, letting the silence in the room speak for itself as each detail landed. When she finished, Corvath Des rose from his seat once again, though his voice carried far less certainty than it had during the first emergency session. He said that even if the fleet's actions had been unauthorized, This did not excuse humanity from destroying Threll vessels without first bringing the matter before the Council for judgment. He argued that Earth had appointed itself judge, prosecutor, and enforcer all at once, bypassing the very system that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral action between member species. It was a fair point, and I could see several delegates nodding along, especially those who represented smaller species worried about what precedent this set for larger powers acting without oversight. If humanity could respond this decisively without Council approval, what would stop other member species from doing the same thing under different circumstances? Laura Bennett, present in person this time, stood to respond. She acknowledged that Earth understood the concern, and that she did not dismiss the importance of Council oversight in matters between member species, but she reminded the Chamber of the report Earth had filed days before the attack, warning of exactly this danger, and how that report had been deprioritized without proper investigation. She asked the Chamber directly what alternative they believed Earth had, once weapons were already being fired at their people, other than to wait for a Council vote that could take days to organize while their crew remained under active attack. The Chamber fell quiet again. Nobody had a good answer to that question either. A delegate from a species called the Farron, small furred beings known across the Council for their careful legal minds, raised a new point that shifted the conversation. She asked whether the true concern in the room was really about procedure at all, or whether it was about the fact that humanity had demonstrated a capability nobody had expected them to possess, and that the discomfort many delegates felt was less about broken rules and more about broken assumptions. I watched several delegates shift in their seats at this question, myself included. She was right, and everyone in that chamber knew it. The procedural argument was real, but it was not the reason the room felt the way it did. The real reason was fear, plain and simple. The sudden realization that the species everyone had ranked near the bottom of every military assessment had just proven those assessments completely wrong. Laura Bennett addressed this directly, her voice remaining calm even as the weight of her words settled over the chamber. She said humanity had never hidden its capabilities out of deception or dishonesty. She said every Council member species had the same access to observe human technology, human ships, and human weapons during the years since Earth joined this assembly. She said the difference was that humanity had simply never been forced to demonstrate the full extent of what they had built, because until that day, no other species had ever pushed them into a position where demonstration became necessary. She then said something that I believe changed the tone of the entire session. She said humanity's history was filled with long periods of conflict among its own nations, conflicts that had taught hard lessons about the cost of being unprepared and about the importance of restraint even when possessing significant strength. She said Earth had chosen, as a unified species finally at peace with itself, to build its defenses quietly rather than announce them, because a species that broadcasts its strength invites challenges from those who wish to test it, while a species that simply prepares in silence avoids that danger entirely, right up until the moment preparation becomes necessary. I found myself thinking about Vecthaler's own homeworld during this speech, about Isvena and its long history of careful diplomacy built on centuries of avoiding direct conflict through negotiation rather than strength. I wondered whether humanity's quiet years on the Council had actually been closer to my own people's philosophy than any of us had realized, simply expressed through different means. The session continued for several more hours, moving through difficult questions about oversight, about whether Earth's automated response protocols violated any existing treaties, and about what safeguards should exist to prevent similar situations in the future. Daniel Voss spoke at one point, addressing a concern raised by the Ilketh delegate about whether humanity's automated systems could ever misidentify a threat and respond against an innocent party by mistake. He explained, carefully and without any hint of pride, that Earth's response protocols required multiple confirmed indicators before activation, including verified weapons fire against a human vessel, confirmed absence of any legitimate authorization for that fire, and a mandatory warning period given to all nearby ships before any response could occur. He said these safeguards existed precisely because Earth understood the danger of a weapon acting without proper judgment, and had spent considerable effort ensuring that judgment remained built into the system at every stage. This answer seemed to ease some of the tension in the room, though not all of it. A representative from the Overend species, the same engineers who had helped analyze the sensor data with us, asked whether Earth would be willing to share more information about the nature of their defensive technology with the Council's security office, given what had just been demonstrated. Laura Bennett's response to this question was careful and measured. She said Earth remained committed to cooperation with the Council on matters of shared security, but that certain details about their defensive capabilities would remain confidential, the same way many other species on this Council maintained confidentiality around their own most sensitive technologies. She reminded the chamber that the Threll themselves had never fully disclosed the details of their strongest weapons systems either, and that this was a standard and reasonable practice among sovereign member species, not a unique demand from Earth alone. Nobody could argue with this point, since it was true. Every major species maintained some level of secrecy around its most advanced technology. The discomfort in the room was not really about Earth withholding information. It was about Earth withholding information that turned out to be far more significant than anyone had assumed possible. Toward the end of that long session, the Council reached a decision, though it was not the kind of decision anyone could have predicted at the start of the day. Rather than condemning Earth's actions or imposing any sanctions, the Chamber voted, somewhat reluctantly, to formally acknowledge that the Threll fleet had acted without proper authorization, and that Earth's response, while unprecedented in its speed and precision, had occurred within the bounds of legitimate self-defense, given the immediate threat to its crew. Korvath Des did not look pleased with this outcome, but he offered no further argument, perhaps sensing that continuing to push the matter would only draw more attention to the failures within his own delegation's chain of command. The Threll military officers responsible for the unauthorized attack were quietly recalled for internal investigation, a process I suspected would take considerable time to resolve given how much embarrassment it clearly caused their leadership. As the session finally ended and delegates began filing out of the chamber, I noticed something different in the way people moved and spoke around the human representatives. Where once there had been polite dismissiveness, small conversations that trailed off the moment a human delegate approached, or seats left carefully distant from where humans typically sat, there was now a different kind of quiet, one built from careful attention rather than disregard. I approached Sella Vantor as we left the chamber together, and I asked her what she thought this meant for the Council going forward. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, her centuries of experience clearly weighing on her response. She said that every species on this Council had spent years building an image of humanity based on incomplete information, judging their strength by outdated measurements and assuming that quiet manners meant limited capability. She said today had proven, in the clearest way possible, that such assumptions were not just wrong, but dangerously wrong, the kind of mistake that could have cost the Threll far more than 12 warships if their commanders had chosen to escalate further instead of dismissing the warning they were given. I asked her if she believed the other species on the Council would change how they treated humanity moving forward. She smiled slightly, an expression I had rarely seen from her during our years serving together. She said change would come slowly, because pride and old assumptions rarely disappear overnight, especially among species who had spent generations viewing themselves as naturally superior to newer members of this assembly. But she said something had shifted permanently that day, something that could not be undone regardless of how slowly attitudes evolved. She said every delegate who had witnessed that attack or reviewed the evidence afterward would carry a small, persistent doubt from that point forward, a quiet voice reminding them never again to assume they fully understood what humanity was capable of, simply because humanity chose not to speak of it openly. I thought about her words for the rest of that evening, walking alone through the station corridors once again, past the same observation window where Daniel Voss had spoken to me days earlier. I understood then that the true impact of that single attack was not measured only in the 12 warships that had been destroyed. It was measured in the quiet, permanent shift in how an entire galaxy would view its newest member from that day forward. A shift built not from fear alone, but from the uncomfortable recognition that we had spent years underestimating a species that had simply been listening, watching, and preparing all along. The weeks that followed brought changes to the Council that I could not have predicted even after everything I had already witnessed. It began with small things, details that most delegates might not have noticed unless they had spent as much time watching humanity as I had since the attack. Human representatives, once seated at the far edges of the chamber during general assemblies, found themselves invited to sit closer to the central platform during discussions involving matters of security. Requests for meetings with Earth's diplomatic staff, once handled by junior aides from other delegations, were now often personally attended by senior ambassadors who had previously never bothered to learn the names of their human counterparts. I noticed this shift most clearly during a routine session about resource distribution along a shared border region, a topic that would normally draw little attention from anyone outside the species directly involved. When Daniel Voss stood to present Earth's position on the matter, I watched delegates who had once continued their side conversations through similar presentations fall completely silent, listening to every word with careful attention. It struck me as almost strange, watching a room full of powerful beings hang on to the words of a young human diplomat discussing something as unremarkable as mineral rights, simply because they were no longer certain what quiet confidence might be hiding behind his calm explanations. Korvath Des, to his credit, made a public statement roughly 2 weeks after the incident, acknowledging that the Threll military officers responsible for the unauthorized attack had been formally removed from their positions following an internal investigation. He did not offer an apology directly to Earth, which surprised no one given how proud his species had always been, but he did state clearly that the Threll Assembly recognized the seriousness of what had occurred and intended to review its own protocols to prevent similar unauthorized actions in the future. It was as close to an admission of fault as anyone expected from a species that had spent generations viewing itself as one of the strongest powers in the galaxy. I spent considerable time during those weeks speaking with other delegates about what they had taken away from the incident, partly out of my own curiosity, and partly because Sela Vantor had asked me to help compile a report for our own government back on Isvena. Most conversations followed a similar pattern. Delegates admitted, often reluctantly, that they had misjudged humanity's capabilities, and many expressed a new caution about how they approached interactions with Earth's representatives going forward. One conversation stood out to me more than the others. I spoke with the young Ilketh delegate who had asked so many pointed questions during the emergency sessions, a being named Torv Amsel who represented one of the smaller and more vulnerable species on the Council. He told me that for his people, the attack had meant something different than it did for larger powers like the Threll. He said his species had always lived under the quiet fear of larger neighbors who could act against them with little consequence, and that watching humanity demonstrate both overwhelming capability and careful restraint at the same time had given his people something they rarely felt on this council, a sense that perhaps not every powerful species intended to use its strength carelessly. I asked him if he trusted humanity more now, or less, given what had happened. He considered the question seriously before answering, choosing his words the way careful diplomats often do. He said trust was not quite the right word yet, since trust required more time and more shared experience than a single event could provide. But he said respect had certainly grown, and that respect built on genuine capability, rather than empty promises or diplomatic reassurances, tended to last far longer than the kind built on words alone. About a month after the incident, I finally had the opportunity to speak with Laura Bennett directly again, the first real conversation we had shared since our brief exchange months before the attack. I found her in one of the station's quiet observation lounges, looking out at the same starfield that had occupied my own thoughts so many times during the previous weeks. I asked her something that had been on my mind since that first conversation we shared long ago, back when I had assumed her quiet manner simply reflected a species still finding its place among older, more established powers. I asked her whether humanity had always planned to reveal its true capabilities eventually, or whether the attack had simply forced their hand earlier than they intended. She was quiet for a moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her before. Not fear, but something closer to careful honesty. She said humanity had genuinely hoped they would never need to demonstrate what they had built. She said the years spent developing their defensive capabilities had never been about seeking recognition or respect from the wider galaxy. They had been about ensuring that Earth, a species that had only recently learned to unite under a single peaceful government after centuries of internal conflict, would never again find itself vulnerable to the kind of aggression that had shaped so much of its own difficult history. She said the attack on the Wanderer's hope had forced Earth to reveal more than they had hoped to reveal this early in their membership on the Council, but that in some ways she believed it had happened for a reason. She said humanity had spent 8 cycles quietly observing how this council operated, learning which species could be trusted, which held quiet ambitions of dominance over smaller members, and which genuinely believed in the fair principles this assembly claimed to represent. I asked her if humanity ever worried about becoming exactly what other species feared, a power capable of ending conflicts before anyone else even had the chance to respond, and whether that kind of strength might eventually change who they were as a people. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her expression that reminded me of the quiet exhaustion I had noticed in Daniel Voss weeks earlier, the look of someone carrying a responsibility far heavier than most people around them ever realized. She said that fear had shaped much of humanity's history already, long before Earth ever joined this council, and that the lessons learned from those difficult centuries were exactly why they had built their capabilities the way they did, with restraint built carefully into every system, with warnings given before every response, and with a genuine reluctance to ever use what they had built unless every other option had truly been exhausted. She said humanity understood, perhaps better than most species in this galaxy, what happens when great strength is used without restraint, because they had lived through chapters of their own history where exactly that mistake had cost millions of lives. She said the goal was never to become a power that other species feared without reason. The goal was to become a power that other species respected because they understood, clearly and without doubt, that Earth would only ever act when genuinely provoked, and would always act with the minimum necessary force required to end a threat rather than escalate it further. I left that conversation with a different understanding of humanity than I had carried for the 6 cycles I had served alongside their representatives. I no longer saw them as the newest, weakest member of this council, tolerated out of obligation rather than genuine respect. I saw a species that had endured centuries of difficult lessons about the cost of conflict, and had chosen, quietly and without seeking recognition, to build a kind of strength defined as much by restraint as by capability. In the cycles that followed, humanity's role within the Council continued to grow, not through demands for greater influence or louder voices in every debate, but through the same quiet consistency they had always shown. Other species began seeking their counsel on matters of security more frequently, trusting the careful judgment behind decisions that had once been dismissed as simply cautious or inexperienced. The Threll Assembly, humbled by the events surrounding the incident, worked more closely with Earth on shared border security than they ever had before, a partnership that would have seemed impossible before that single attack changed the way both species viewed one another. I still think often about that first message that appeared on our screens, the simple line reporting an attack against a human vessel that most of us initially dismissed as a minor border skirmish. I think about the countdown that followed, the calm 10-minute warning given before a response most of us assumed would take days to organize. I think about the silence that fell over the entire council chamber when 12 armed warships vanished from our screens in less time than it takes to properly read a formal report. Most of all, I think about a quiet conversation I once had with Laura Bennett, long before any of this happened, when she told me humanity spent more time listening than speaking. I understand now what she truly meant. Humanity had spent 8 cycles quietly observing this council, learning everything they needed to know about the species around them, while carefully building the kind of strength that would never need to be demonstrated unless absolutely necessary. When that moment finally came, they did not hesitate, and they did not need a second attempt to make their point clear. The galaxy learned, in a single afternoon, that the quietest voice in the room is not always the weakest one. Sometimes it is simply the voice that has been patient enough to wait for the moment when its actions will speak louder than any words ever could. And for every species sitting on this council since that day, myself included, that lesson has never once been forgotten.